Before I start, I just wanted to know what special day today is. Not only is it Earth Day, but a few hundred miles south, leaders from all over the world are in New York to sign the Paris Agreement, which was really a triumph of multinational diplomacy. We're going to hear, and we already have heard, a lot of dark things today about climate denialism and our broken political system, and all those things are true. But it's also true that we agreed on a path forward to deal with climate change that is truly historic. Of course, the implementation is the big question we all face. But we should be glad about where we've come. We should be proud of that agreement, and we should honor all of us who contributed to making that agreement a reality. So this morning you've heard already some very rich talks about both the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of denialism and how that finds its expression in climate change. I'd like to talk about an aspect of this that's somewhat more direct. I believe that some of the denialism that we see in American politics actually has a more direct cause. I believe that it was manufactured by the companies that have a vested interest in denialism, some of the leading fossil fuel companies. And so what I'm going to talk about is what we know about that campaign, what we know about its effects, and what we can do about it. To start the story, I'm going to go back to approximately the year 1988. That's a year in which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. It was the year that James Hansen testified, and climate change really became the leading issue. One of the remarkable things that has come out in the last several months due to investigative journalism is that the fossil fuel companies knew all about climate science many years before 1988. They were doing some of the leading scientific research on this topic, and their findings very much matched what was being said in that year, 1988. But after James Hansen, after the IPCC, the world was starting to have climate negotiations. Policies were starting to go forward to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere to prevent emissions from getting worse. And how did these companies respond? Well, the first thing they did was they formed a global climate communications apparatus. And before unleashing that, they actually hired their own team of scientists to give them a briefing on what the state of the science was at that time about climate change. And the head of that organization was a guy named Leonard Bernstein, obviously not the composer, but he was Mobil's chief scientist. And I'd like to share with you his exact words, what he told these companies in 1995. I'm quoting. "The scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on climate is well established and cannot be denied." That was Mobil's chief scientist's words back in 1995. The memo then went on to explore other alternative theories that had been propounded at that time, and the memo basically dismissed all of them and said that they were not capable of explaining the temperature increases and various other things that were being experienced at the time. It turns out that what the scientists said in 1995 very much matched what Exxon's chief scientific advisor said in 1978. And again, I'm quoting, "Present thinking holds that man," and I realize that is an out-of-date stereotype, but that's what he said, "man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical." Boy, was that a prescient statement back in 1978. It also turns out that not only did the companies know about this because they had their own scientists working on it, they actually made a whole number of investment business decisions based on what they knew about climate science. They started investing in raising offshore oil platforms to anticipate sea level rise. They took measures to protect pipelines from breaking due to warming ground, and various other things. So we can establish, we know that they knew about the climate science, we know that they were actually acting upon the climate science. So the question back in the 90s is, what did they decide to do with that knowledge? And there were three paths that they could have taken. One would have been to widely disseminate what they knew and sound the alarm bells about this. And imagine the credibility that the oil companies would have had at that point if they had disclosed and revealed all this with no financial incentive to do that. And actually there was one company that for a very short time did choose that path. There was British Petroleum back in 1997, I believe you may remember. They, for a while, they called themselves Beyond Petroleum, and they acknowledged climate change and they invested in renewable energy, but that commitment didn't last very long and it kind of fizzled out. The second path would be to really say nothing about what they knew and continue with the business as usual path, and some of the companies certainly did that. The third path was to create a campaign of disinformation and denial to discourage the political sector from having a sufficient consensus to take action to move towards clean energy. And unfortunately, it was the third path that many of the companies decided to go. So the American Petroleum Institute formed a global communications team. It had BP and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil and Shell, and they actually wrote a memo about their communication strategy. It was leaked. Here's what it says, again, their words, not mine. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, and note that word understand is in quotes, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Recognitions of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. So that's what the goal of this strategy is. And then in language that can only be compared to Spectre from James Bond movies, they go further on to say, and I'm quoting, unless climate change becomes a non-issue, meaning that Kyoto proposals are defeated and there are no further initiatives to thwart the threat of climate change, there may be no moment when we can declare victory for our efforts. So that's what they said. In the memo, they lay out a strategy about how to achieve their goal. It involves cultivating contrarian scientists. It involves spoon-feeding journalists with information. It involves getting into the educational curriculum of schools and a lot of public-facing communications. So what happened? They implemented the strategy, and you saw ad after ad, op-ed after op-ed, challenging climate science all throughout the late 90s and the 2000s, at a time period, by the way, when people were still potentially open for this. And Lee points out that you reach a point of no return with people's beliefs where you can't really persuade them anymore. We were not at that point in that era. And unfortunately, this communication had the effect of moving people in that direction. I'll point out just one of my personal favorites from these ads was from Mobil in 1998. Remember, just 3 years before, they had gotten a memo from their own chief scientist saying you can't refute climate science. But here's what it says. The science of climate change is too uncertain. Scientists cannot predict with certainty if temperatures will increase, by how much, and where the change will occur. So, a public ad that clearly is refuted by their own scientific evidence. We also saw CEOs of these companies publicly saying these things. I'll give you a minute just to digest this one. Look at what Exxon's CEO was saying in 1997 versus what their chief scientist told them in 1978 about the state of science. Similarly, look at the urgency of the Exxon scientists. Look at the lack of urgency of the Exxon CEO. So, I don't want to over-dramatize this, but in this area, it's hard to find smoking guns like these, and there are a lot of them. It's all, and it's been exposed. A second piece of the strategy. I told you that part of the idea was to fund scientists that offered an alternative theory. By the way, one of the scientists that they decided to fund was this guy named Willie Soon. He's not actually a climate scientist. And his theory is that global warming and variations in temperature are caused by solar variability from the sun. By the way, that was one of the theories that the ExxonMobil scientists looked at and debunked in the memo. But Exxon and others spent approximately over $1 million funding Mr. Soon, and it was a very unusual funding arrangement. He works for the Smithsonian Institute, and the conditions of his funding were that first of all, Smithsonian would agree not to disclose who was funding Dr. Soon. Second, that these companies that were funding Dr. Soon's work would have the right to review it before it became published. None of that was disclosed, and so for about 10 years, this contrarian science was propagated, and it was very, very influential. It is still cited by many political climate deniers, like Senator Inhofe. So these types of tactics have worked, and again, they provide a little bit of misleading ammunition to those people who are already philosophically inclined to dispute the overwhelming consensus of science. They're that little nugget of apparent scientific validity to add to people's desire to not accept climate science. So they work together with these psychological and philosophical underpinnings. And one thing I want to make clear is this deception is still going on. Not as directly as it was back in the 2000s and the 90s, but indirectly. Most of these companies now say on their website that they understand and recognize climate science, but they continue to fund groups indirectly that do everything but recognize climate science and do everything but work for reform. So this is really still with us. So what's been the effect of all this? This is a little bit to me like Alice in Wonderland. On the left-hand side of the page is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you can see that as time goes on, the level of certainty about climate change increases. Back in 2001, 66% confidence level. Back now by 2013, 95% confidence level. And as you may know, the IPCC synthesizes the work of hundreds or more scientists all around the world. So they can speak to the consensus. Similarly, the number of people who in general believe and accept climate science has gone up as the scientific consensus has gone up. But paradoxically, the polarization of this issue has also gone up. So the people who don't believe climate science don't believe it even more strongly than they did before. So we have this strange situation where the scientists are all coming together, general public opinion is coming together, but this fissure between those who accept the climate science and those who don't gets ever stronger. Here's one way to visualize this. This is George H.W. Bush running for president in 1988, saying we're going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Can you imagine any of the candidates running for the Republican nomination saying anything remotely like that during today's election? Instead, what we get, and I'm sorry to pick on Ted Cruz, it looks like he's deluded, but instead, we get a guy who literally is saying that people who believe in climate science are like flat earthers, and people like him who deny climate science are like Galileo. So it's just, look at what's changed and ask yourself, is it really just an accident that that this polarization of beliefs have occurred? And the real shame of this is I'm going back to that 1988 date when the consensus was emerging. We've now doubled our emissions of greenhouse gases since 1988. So if you take that as a time that we knew or should have known what the harm we were causing, we've made things twice as bad since that time. And that's really tragedy. So what do we do about this? Well, first of all, the good news is that the chickens are starting to come home to roost here. UCS put out a document over the summer called the Climate Deception Dossiers, which I recommend anyone to read, which outlines some of this conduct. In the fall, we saw some stories by Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia School of Journalism that take our work and go many layers deeper. And the political sector is starting to react to this. We have 4 attorneys general who have now launched investigations into this deception. We have 40-odd members of Congress calling for a federal investigation, 2 of the presidential candidates, numerous legal scholars, all looking into the question, what did these companies know? What did they tell their investors? And what did they tell the public? And did they violate the law by doing that? The science is also developing in ways I want to talk about. UCS, in conjunction with many other scientists, are now trying to apportion the relative responsibility of each of these companies for global warming. And what we and others have done, believe it or not, is go back through approximately 150 years of records to painstakingly establish how much fossil fuels each of these companies has introduced into the atmosphere. That's helpful. And you can see, you can start getting some percentages. That becomes important because another way that science is evolving is our ability to pinpoint the fingerprint of climate change in certain natural disasters, one being Superstorm Sandy. And to give you an example, those blue areas shown on the map are areas that got hit hard by Superstorm Sandy because of storm surge and a combination of storm surge and sea level rise. Those red areas are areas that scientists say got hit because of 8 inches of sea level rise. And without the sea level rise, they would have been okay. And so if you do the calculations, sea level rise added about $2 billion to Sandy's toll in New York City. Now that doesn't sound like that much, but imagine if you applied the same methodology to the typhoon that Bill McKibben talked about, or the heat waves in Europe and the Middle East, or the drought in California, or the damaged properties. The point of all this is we can pinpoint the relative share of these companies. We can pinpoint with a reasonable degree of certainty how much those emissions have contributed to actual damages. So what do we do with all this information? First of all, we think it's only a matter of time until the state attorneys general actually bring some of these companies to court. And documents will be unearthed, much the way they were in the litigation over the tobacco industry, and we'll probably find out a whole lot more about this. This will undoubtedly assist in shareholder resolutions. It will provide information that will be valuable for the divestment movement. But perhaps most importantly, the United States and other countries need to put in place a whole lot of new policies to meet the pledge we made in Paris and to get a handle on this problem. And we all know that one of the biggest barriers to those policies is the outsized influence of the fossil fuel industry. And so this disclosure, this dissemination of this information, just as what happened with the tobacco companies, we believe will erode their social license. That's the license that companies have that gives them trust and influence in the public sphere and reduce their ability to block reform. So what do we expect companies to do now that this has been exposed? Because we don't think it's too late for companies to behave responsibly. And so our demands are first, complete cessation of any support, directly or indirectly, to climate science disinformation. They've got to get out of the business of that. They have to actually support sensible climate policies. And many of them say, for example, that they support a carbon tax, which we do think would be a workable policy. The problem is, if you look at who they fund legislators that routinely vote against carbon pricing and rarely support those who support carbon prices. So they have to actually support sensible climate policies, not just with words. There are ways in which these companies could reduce the carbon content of the goods. They don't have to invest in tar sanding, for example. They can get out of those high carbon fuels. And finally, given the overwhelming need, particularly for developing countries, both to deal with what's coming, but also to help them decarbonize their own economies, these companies could start putting funds and make them available for these purposes. So I just want to conclude by saying some of the denialism we see happened for a reason. It didn't happen by accident. But I am encouraged that after many years of sort of giving these companies a free pass, people are starting to notice this conduct and take action. And I do believe, in conjunction with a lot of other things, that this will help us get to the point where we can have really significant transformational climate policy. Thank you very much.